Hi, guys. We're rounding in on the end of our first month together as the Jellybots Patreon. And I just want to say before I start getting into this tutorial how sincerely grateful I am for all of your support, your comments, some of the fan art, just the messages, and obviously the financial support. It's been so much fun getting started on this and only up from here. So, as promised, I wanted to kick off this series of tutorials, the first one being primarily about the use of color, which is a question that I've gotten a lot over the years in my art, about how do you use color, how do you start and sort of get your mind wrapped around the use of color in work. Since Jellybots obviously is one of those most colorful examples of the sort of thing that I do, it's an obvious place to sort of start talking about it. But to begin, I thought it might be really good, useful, and important for us to start to define some of our terms. There are basic things to do with color that seem really obvious to somebody, once you've been sort of on this sort of train ride of art making for a while, but I find some people don't always know, and they were really eye-opening for me. So one of the first sort of basic principles of color is color contrast, and a big part of that is understanding the use of complementary colors. And complementary colors are basically, if you've ever seen a color wheel, they are opposites on the side of the color wheel. So let me just, the basic pairings that we're talking about are orange and blue, purple and yellow, and green and red. Those are sort of the building blocks of the idea of color contrast. And for me starting out, it seemed obvious, but it was something that I just had never heard until, I think, actually part of the way into college for me, into art school. I mean, basically, the way that it works, right, is that you've got sort of a color wheel of colors sort of melding into each other and mixing. And in order to fully understand that, I'm just going to do a really quick... I know it's possible to, like... well, we'll just... we'll just say, and that goes there. Actually, that's atrocious. I can't... I'm trying to explain a color wheel. I should just use some sort of a diagram. But now I'm stubborn, so I am going to do this by hand. I find actually, as ridiculous as this might seem, that doing things by hand is pretty useful in terms of understanding what we're talking about here. Getting your head around, like, okay, so these are like abstract concepts, but really what is it that we are discussing? And I find it's easiest to understand that myself when I do things by hand. We use the computer for everything these days, and it's a really useful tool, but there's no substitute for just mixing paint and trying it out yourself. So I'm just going to do the most basic version of this possible. So complementary color pairings, right, is maybe total old news for you, but just in case it's not, super important. So blue and orange, right, are across the color wheel from each other. So are red and green and yellow and purple. Anarchy. Those three pairings are essentially opposites, sort of along the lines of black and white, but in color. So if you want something in a blue environment to pop, using something along the lines of an orange is going to be a really powerful color contrast. Likewise, if you have a primarily orange environment, you're going to want to use blue. Likewise, with all of these pairings, the contrast is just about as intense as it gets, especially red and green. Some people are red and green colorblind, but that's because even for people who aren't, there's a really intense vibration between the two colors here when you get them next to each other on screen or just in real life. The intense contrast is really obvious. Your eyes kind of buzz with it. It's very, very eye-searing in its most saturated form. So using those is sort of key to understanding. So let me just work up a really quick example here for you. So if I were to create a quick little, this is going to be really sloppy stuff, because that is, I think, one of the easiest ways to learn is with quick illustrations. It will not be my most beautiful illustration work. I did prepare some sketches here below for earlier, so that there's something for you guys to look at that's not just my terrible thing. But if you have a forest at night, right, and the palette's primarily blue, one of the most tried and true color pairings is blue and orange, and you want to draw the eye. Nothing's going to do that quite like orange fire, right? The lights in a little cottage, a campfire in the woods and stuff like that, that's going to be primarily blue. If you shift that towards purple, if you're in a deep purple space, and purple and blue kind of are next to each other on the color wheel, they blend in a pleasant way. And actually I use a lot of both purple and blue and sort of the spaces in between. But likewise, in a similar purple forest, I'm just gonna really sloppily get at this here. Your little fairy lights, little lightning bugs and stuff like that, in yellow are going to be really high contrast and obvious and fun. So again, one of the reasons, I think subtle reasons, that something like Little Red Riding Hood works the way that it does and is so iconic is because largely we associate a daytime in the forest with the color green. Our eyes are super used to seeing green. Green is like a very soothing, neutral color, but also not very dynamic or exciting, often. Probably some pushback on that. That's fair. That's an opinion. But by and large, I remember even talking to some publishing friends, they don't use green on covers. They find that, like, by and large, book covers that are heavy in green don't sell well, which is an interesting insight. I think it's just because we're so used to that. But Red Riding Hood, obviously, in a green space, her little hood and coat in red is a really intense color pop. So here, those are just sort of three of the most common color pairings. And I know that seems simple, and right now that looks totally, totally rough. But honestly, it's very possible that it will be the best lesson I have to offer you guys today, is using color contrast via complementary color pairings. So complementary just means across the color wheel from each other, and color contrast is what results when you combine complementary colors or colors in a similar system relationship to each other, sort of across the wheel, that create that kind of delightful, intense friction. Let's pump that orange up a little bit here. So a lot of what people respond to in my work and in color in general is that color contrast. Subtle uses of things like this help to give the illusion of light. That's a big part of it, is using the color, the relative contrast, and some of those like basic visual principles to create the illusion of light. So what am I talking about? Let's show you an example. And as we do talk about an example, we'll talk a little bit about local color. Let's see how best to do this. So let's say we have a sort of cool gray cube. Pardon me, I'm just going to take a couple seconds to draw the roughest, jankiest gray cube ever. Please do not judge me too much on the content. Focus on the principles and less on the drawing. So we've got our gray cube. Now, I think maybe to explain this principle better, it might be important to go a little bit beyond gray. So for whatever reason, this cement cube is, just for the purposes of example, is mossy and covered in grass. And just bear with me here. Again, really janky stuff. And part of talking about stuff and drawing stuff at the same time just means that the drawing is just going to suffer. It's going to be kind of rough. But that's part of the fun of a tutorial. So what I'm doing right now is what most people know how to do with color instinctively. And what we're doing is we're picking out local colors. Now that's another term. So color contrast, complementary colors, right, we've sort of covered really quickly. Another really important term is local color. And you know what? We're going to make this it's autumn, right? So we're going to have like kind of orange leaves. Maybe some ochre, right? Ochre's great. Local color is the color a thing is. And that seems so obvious and so simple and kind of a little bit dumb. But local color, and here we're going to move that to a place where there's less this other stuff to look at. We'll make it real small. So everybody knows, right, that stone is gray, grass is green, trunks are brown. You know, these are the sort of basic out of the Crayola box colors that you go with. The beginning of my process always has to do with setting up local color. Set up the drawing as simply as possible in local color. But that only gets you so far, right? We've got all the stuff is there, and ideally, as you practice, learn, and grow, these local colors will get more nuanced and more lovely and beautiful. And a big part of the fight with color is to create color harmony as you create light. I guess we'll get to that soon. But color harmony has to do with sort of the blending of colors and stuff that sits nicely together. And we're going to create a little bit of blending by throwing some sort of moss up the tree here. We'll make that darker so it stands out a bit. Well, local color will get you pretty far. But with the kind of stuff that I do, that's a little more rendered, has a little bit more sort of shape to it. Mind you, if you were doing sort of a traditional animated style, you could stop pretty soon after this with just the simple shading, sort of cell shading is what we call it, right? Let me just make sure this is still recording. Yep, good. And you'd be done. But with sort of a more painterly style, things get a little more complicated there. So we got our mossy, ochre-leaved tree on a block of gray cement, right? And that's all the local colors. That gets you this far, but then what we want to talk about is the color of light. And this is where the complementary colors come in. Local color is the color it is under completely neutral white light, right? Brown, ochre, gray, green. Now, if you light it, you're introducing a whole new palette of colors. And generally speaking, sunlight is a warm, buttery yellow. And it depends on your time of day, depends on your context, whether the environment is very bright or very dim, whether the light is colored from a lamp or something like that. But sunlight is generally a pretty warm color. And that's going to be an important part of this. So one of the easiest ways to sort of experiment with this is with layer modes. I use overlay to block in basic light and multiply to block in basic shadows. So first we're going to block in some basic light. So we're going to use a pale sort of cream color in overlay just to show you what I mean. Because, and what's good about overlay is that you can affect all the local colors with a single stroke, right? It's a good way to set it up. It might not be the best way to learn, but for the purposes of quick demonstration, I'm going to just show you this. So now what we've got is we've got some light falling on this cube, casting a little bit of shadow on the dark side of the tree, it's affecting everything. And so now what you have is no longer purely local color, right? Local color is the midtones, the stuff that's kind of in between, sort of a medium brown, a medium green, a medium ochre. Now you get into light yellows, very bright ones. And so now you've created a sense of light and color contrast, right? One thing, that they teach you classically about the cube kind of stuff is that each side is going to get a different amount of light, right? Some are going to be in purer shadow than others. So we're going to create a little bit of light bleed, which is just sort of a soft bleed and blur of gradient light. So next, we're going to use, there we go, I have that multiply layer. So the light is yellow, right? It's kind of an orangey, a little bit of a buttery yellow, right? So we come up here and we take a look. So it's somewhere right in here, right between yellow and orange. So the shadows are going to be complementary. And that's a key principle about light, is that if you cast a light of any color, the shadows are going to contain some element of its complement. So with that in mind, on a multiply layer, I'm going to take kind of a light purpley blue, right? Something in that zone. And I'm going to use that to create my shadows. Again, this is I want a nice saturated kind of example so that you can see the effect of the color. Now, because that's a complementary color of the ochre, it's going to really neutralize. The thing is, when you use, this is pretty complicated, but that's actually not that complicated. You guys are smart. When you use complementary colors on top of each other, they will neutralize. And so sometimes you have to work to fight that a little bit and kind of get stuff back. But it's not as simple as adding black or white to create light. We're adding, this is again a very extreme example of how complementary color and light might work. Again, multiply is allowing me to affect the green and the gray and the brown and the ochre all at once with a single color, which is always nice, I think. So basically, and again, very basic, I'm going to reduce so that's it with just the light, and now adding sort of that purple shadow really gives us a lot more juice to it. Now, the method that I'm using here, where I keep my light and my shadow on separate layers, is one that I use for more complex pieces as well. What I like to do, and this is my little personal secret, so don't tell anybody, is I lock the layers. So all my shadow is on this one layer. I've now locked the pixels so I can paint within the shadow I've just drawn. And because it's super complementary with the ochre and it's creating kind of a browny gray I don't love, I'm going to brush in some pink. I'm going to sort of allow some of the light in. What this sort of does is gives the, you might hear people talk about subsurface scattering, and that's that kind of light that happens between your fingers when you hold a flashlight up on the other side of them. It's like the red light that gets underneath the skin. It's light that doesn't just hit it, but it's light that's coming through it. So this would be like the shadow when it's just hit by light, hard contrast. But if it's a little translucent and there's a little bit of bleed to it, you're going to get a little bit, maybe some nice sort of bluer bounce light to this. So it's all cooler. I'm using a pink instead of, just a darker yellow. I'm using a purple instead of a darker brown, and I'm using a blue instead of a darker gray. Those are all grouped into kind of a complementary shift away from the ochre. And I can do the same thing, locking the pixels and nuancing some of my light with maybe a little bit more pink to create more of a sunset kind of vibe on those leaves. Right? So right there, I mean, in its very basic form are some of the main ways I use color. And that's pretty tricky in this example, and so I feel like we're probably going to need to explore that a little further on some examples. So I did some sketches earlier to help illustrate a little bit more of what I'm talking about and use it in a real process. So here's my workflow and how I usually do things as I apply this to something, right? So I've drawn this old man. We like him. He's nice and neutral. He's very simple. So I'm going to find kind of a mid-tone Caucasian kind of buttery little beigey business over here. And let's see, I'll set his lines to multiply and this layer to normal. So what I'm doing here is I'm using these lines, the sketch, as a guideline. And now I'm doing what I call blocking in. Blocking in means, for me, it just using local color, so the color under a neutral mid-light that his skin might be. And first, before we get into all the details of the nuance of his skin tones, I'm just gonna get in there and create the shape. And usually when I'm not recording myself and when I take more time, this part of the process would go for a long time. I like to relax, throw on a podcast or an audiobook, and just kind of turn my mind off a little bit and just lose myself in doing pure shape and color. Now, the method I described with the tree, it'll get you sort of maybe like 80%, 75 to 80% of the way with your color blocking. That's usually how it works for me. It'll get you pretty far, and then you'll realize quickly that everything starts to look very samey, very very similar because you're using the same layer modes and stuff like that. And that's where just understanding the principles enough to be able to improvise, that last 25 to 20% of the process is painting on top, adjusting things, using your eye and your hand to kind of shift things and push the color as far as you can make it go. Now, digital art is a really difficult way to learn color, and I always suggest to people that they try painting first and foremost with real, actual paints. I can't really demo that here for a variety of reasons. There's just something about physically mixing color with a limited set of paints and really limiting your palette that can be a huge help. Because here, within this color palette up here, it's every color possible on a spectrum. And that can be a really difficult thing to begin to choose from, to really start to get your mind around color. So we've got a skin tone, and before I add other local colors, what I'm going to do is I'm going to think about skin. And one of the basic principles of human skin is that it's not all just one color. You have areas that are warmer and areas that are cooler, areas that are pinker and areas that are more yellow and blue. So for the purposes of this example, I'm going to rosy up his nose and his ears. Those are areas where we get a lot of blood, it's a lot of cartilage, we get a lot of light coming through them too. Cheeks get blush. These areas, you don't want to overdo it and make them look drunk, but in order to create some really fun variety of local color, and this is just in the local color stage, we're not talking about light, we're just talking about the nature of this guy's skin. And maybe with this we'll get a little bit, and again I'm brushing it in really light with a big thick brush to sort of show you what I mean. Alright, and then maybe like a kind of a gray blue. Ever notice like old fellows, humans, get kind of gray where their beard kind of has been shaven after a couple days? We even get a little bit of that in and around our eyes, depending. Okay? So I've taken a neutral skin color for this guy, again, neutral Caucasian skin, and added some variation within the local color. If I take the sketch away, you're going to see a little bit of purpley blue where I want it, a little bit of pink near the nose, a little bit more, I'll throw a little bit more in the ear. Cool. His hair and collar was a pretty simple sketch here. Normally I'd get fancy with layers, but I'm going to keep it all in one layer for now, just because we're not talking about layers, we're talking about color. So let's go. Now here's where I like to test things out a little bit. I paint a little. Sometimes what I'll do, I'll see, oh, I like that, but it's a little too far from the skin color, so I'll brush in a little bit. See how it has a gradient here, where the brush kind of moves it towards the skin, and then I'll pick a color that's a little closer to the undertone, and I'll use that instead, which is an easy way to sort of start to get colors to meld together and blend. Does that make sense? Especially for opening local color, and if you're not going with some crazy contrast. And we'll play with a little crazy contrast a little later in this video. So right now I'm just blocking in his beard. And blocking. Again, you know, this process works very differently for different subjects, but I, for some reason, just default to old men when I feel the pressure of trying to figure out how to explain things, or even when my mind just goes neutral, I just draw old white dudes. It's just my favorite totally brainless subject to draw. Just grew up on a lot of fantasy and Lord of the Rings and stuff like that, so just default to wrinkly old dudes. Now there's room for a little blending here, you know, depending on how graphic you want the approach to be versus how painty. Sometimes I make new design or drawing decisions at this phase. It all sort of just depends on how I'm feeling and what the effect is that I want. Over time, you'll get used to, you know, what colors and what parts of the process produce a result that you like. And some of it you can explain, but some of it you really just have to try it and fuss with it and play with the results and see what it is you like and what it is you really don't like. Because color ultimately is super subjective. It's really, each person has such different tastes in terms of what they think is soothing and pleasant and what they really don't like. Often eyebrows are a little bit darker than the hair on someone's head. So I'm going to take a darker gray. Again, I use the gray that I started with, like this, and I just shifted it a little bit darker so that it relates to the gray that I was using, which relates to the skin. You see what I'm doing? So I'm kind of trying to build a set of colors that, even though they're different, we got gray and then a totally like warm peach salmon color for his skin, but they are subtly related to each other. There's a little bit of the salmon in the gray and a little bit of gray in the salmon. And I want a little more variety in this facial hair, so I'm gonna do the same thing I just did. Skew it a little bit blonder from that color and give him some streaks in his beard and his local color. So something like that, right? Yeah, it's a bit much. I'll fight it back. I like to go back and forth a lot as I draw and paint. There we go. Okay. So again, this the term for this is local color, and I call these flats. Some people call them flats as well. Flat colors are just they give you the shape, something to work with, but he's not a fully dimensional, lit, 3D kind of character yet. There's a little ways to go before we get there. We're just going to forget the collar for now. I'm going to use this gray to create an even darker gray for his eyelashes. His little smiling eye here, nice and simple. Part of my process, at least, involves sort of learning what not to show and what I want to show with like hard color differences versus like sculpted light. So for this right now, that's probably all the like local color detail I think I need. It's that simple. before I get into starting to light him. So this gets into another basic principle about color. Limiting your palette, so keeping these colors related, is key. I think a lot of people want to use, and I really wanted to use, wild, bright, crazy colors really soon. But I found I lacked the control of somebody who really understood how to use them. And I learned that by limiting my palette to something more neutral, which is why I'm starting with this old guy and his more earthy, basic colors, because it'll help us understand and build towards some of the wilder, brighter colors that I use in something like Jellybots. So, got a cool face, got the colors blocked in. I'm going to create a new layer, set it to multiply, because I'm going to block in those shadows. Now I know I want the light, just like the tree, we're going to keep it really simple, to be nice and warm. So the shadows are going to be cool. And just to begin, I'm going to use a neutral blue. Keep it really light, actually, really bright neutral blue. Just like that. There we go. And I'm going to go in on this new layer, set to multiply. I'm going to paint that in. I'm going to do it really quickly so that we're not too bogged down in all the other stuff that goes into a drawing, which is quite a bit. And what's fun about multiply, again, is that I can rake a paint stroke across different local colors and create a sense of light that's unified. And that was a big part of it for me, is not going after each color. I'm not shading the skin and then shading the hair separately. I'm sort of melding them together with shadow all at once, to create pools of shadow that relate to each other. Because big part of managing color in a piece and in art in general is making sure it all relates. If colors have nothing to do with each other, if the shadow on the beard doesn't really look like it's cast from the same light as this shadow on the nose, that's when things start to sort of break apart and look really inconsistent. So I'm thinking about light direction, but also sculpting the shape of his face, and generally speaking, we spend a nice amount of time here. And this is like one of the more sort of free-flowing, super painty, creative parts of my process, is just digging into the shape of light as I get into these shadows. This is what's called, oh gosh, I was going to throw a term out, now I've forgotten what I was going to call it. It's kind of additive shadows. I'm adding shadow to the neutral color instead of adding light first. I'm letting the neutral color kind of be the light, and I'll add more light as we go. But this feels very like sculpting. And sculpting is a really important discipline and idea. Like, even if what you really love to do is just draw, thinking about light and shadow, shape in 3 dimensions is a really big, important part of any process. So I'm creating these shadows, and again, it's just a uniform kind of light blue, grayish blue shadow that I'm using to draw this old guy. And again, more time, more detail, but keep this breezy, just leave it right there. So now I've got my shadows on one layer, my local color on another layer, and my sketch on a third. I think we could probably get rid of the sketch for now, and just focus on just the color blocking. So we were talking about how light bleeds through things, right? And another word or term I want to throw at you guys is value hierarchy, and color hierarchy too. within a single design or a painting, you're going to want to create a hierarchy of contrast in light and shadow, which is something you do in black and white, but you also do it in color, and that's going to create a really clear sense of light. And you can do that with color contrast too. So the darker shadows here are getting even purplier, right, as they go, because the light's orange and it's bleeding through kind of reddish, orangey, pinky yellow, like kind of in that warm zone, right? And so where the light's hitting, I'm going to take some kind of pinkish orange, some salmon, and I'm going to throw that into the shadows. I'm going to brush that lightly into the shadows. And see, even just with shadow and local color, we've already created a sense of light. I'm going to brighten these shadows here in the ear, because you get some light coming through the ear, just like your fingers. And in the nose there, some bounce light underneath it. I'll throw some bounce light in these shadows, so bounce light's another concept. You've got light coming at the character, right? It's coming down from here, right? And that light is, we're going to say it's like kind of something like this, right? Nice warm light. You've got kind of purple shadows forming, let's get all up and down here, that form as a result of the yellow light. So again, we've got yellow light and purple shadow that are acting on this guy's face. To enhance that sense of light, we're going to throw in, again with overlay, set to something in that orangey, pinky orange space, that warm lit space. I'm going to throw some of that where it's hottest. So value hierarchy here is the contrast and the way that we draw attention to certain parts that we want you to look at, right? A way I can do that here is by lowering the contrast. So everything gets more dark and purpley away from the light source, right? The local color even becomes more part of the shadow. I'm just brushing purple across the whole thing now, right? We're adding just like a sense of like murky shadow away from the light. And right near the light, the contrast between the shadows, like here, the difference between light and dark is less pronounced. But here it's going to be even more. And the more we do that, the more it's going to draw our attention. Also, the darkness of his eyebrows and his eyelashes are going to help create contrast that's going to draw our eye. Oops, sorry. I have a problem with my layers here. And if the shadow is dark, it implies a deep cut, a deep overhang. His brows are very heavy. And you can just play and adjust. But playing with color instead of just pure black and white is going to get you that luminousness, right? That like juicy, colorful quality. So again, we've got local color where the light, the glowing light, is acting on it. And it's acting on it in areas, I call it areas of focus, right? It's where I want you to look at his sort of nose, eyes. I don't want you to be too focused on the lower parts of the design. And so the finishing touches and sort of the stuff I go in on a normal layer on top. And now I get painty and I add my details. But now I have a structure to hang those on, right? Oops, wrong brush. So I'm adding sort of a bright cream-colored light on top of that. And now I can confidently paint over with colors that I pick myself that are going to add nuance and also draw focus to the bits of the design that I want you to look at. I'm going to sample colors. Another thing I do is I use the color picker as I go to pull in other colors I like so it all feels like it relates still. I'm going to add shape and tone. I'm going to brush away some of that, sculpt some of his stuff back, his shapes back. I'm going to go in and add shadows. It doesn't have to be super strictly, adherent to the layer structure or anything like that, especially when you're painting. It's good to keep your layers nice and clean, but sometimes it's important to just get in there and paint and worry about the layers later. Some of you, that's probably going to freak out some of you, but does that make sense? Hopefully it does. And I know you can't respond because this is just a video. So that's a basic kind of walkthrough on very simple structure of light and shadow and color, complementary and local, that I use when creating simple characters. I have one more prepared section of this, and it's this alien head over here. We're going to take a look at him. Cut and paste. Going to make sure that's on a separate layer, right? We're going to move him into a corner so we're not super distracted by everything else. Lower the contrast on that sketch. There we go. Multiply. Now the same principles apply to really intense color. But you got to work up from somewhere. And I think the temptation is to think about intense color as though rules of light and shadow, neutrality and stuff like that didn't apply. But here we're going to talk about sort of some of the principles, maybe the final major thing I want to introduce to you guys is this concept of sort of saturation and mud. And to do that, we're going to need to start with some pretty crazy stuff. Now I have an instinct built over time, and a lot of this is just practice, about which local colors I want to choose and which ones I like. I can just pick them intuitively out of the color picker. And I wish I could explain exactly how that works in a way that's like, super easy to do. But honestly, some of it, there's no replacement for just long practice. Right now I'm just getting the shape of this weird little buggy alien head, right? So primarily I want him to be kind of blue. Now, different color, different techniques, different projects are going to approach this totally different ways. But within the local color of this character, I want the intensity and the crazy color to come out of it. But I want to set that up in a way that's very structured around the value, sort of the light and shadow, what I'm talking about. When I say value, I mean relative lightness and darkness. And in order to do that, I'm going to create a mud. And one of the things I know about this character that you don't know yet is that he's going to have a lot of like blue and neutral tones to him, but primarily what I'm going to build towards is the orange. So I'm creating an environment, even just on the character, kind of like the example we did with the woods, right? Where I'm setting up color contrast in the design so that I can pop the aspects that I want you to look at. So in order to do that, I'm going to use both light and shadow, right? Dark and light, but also color contrast at the same time and in related ways. So just keep an eye on that. Think about those things while I try to give you an example here. So what I'm doing right now is something I call creating a mud. Now I'm using colors and I'm building it from the bright blue that I had. But in order to get really painty with it, and in order to build towards something that's really fun and has that really juicy quality, funnily enough, I'm using a lot of grays, purple blues. I'm even going to get some like some sort of dark pinks in there, but like a gray pink. You see what I'm saying? Dark gray pinks. And creating a mud is it's just all these colors are blending together, and they're all like relatively low saturation. And some of them have like a deep quality to them, some deep color in them. They look like, sometimes words I fail me when I'm trying to explain some of the color stuff, and it's maybe just good to just look and see. But in order to create a really juicy, bright blue that really catches the eye, using highly saturated dark colors that are sort of purple edging on some of the warmer pinks, but kind of in that purpley blue zone, right, are going to create this beautiful, rich mud of blue-purple goodness that I can bring both a brighter blue out of and really pop an orange on. So I'm going to show you how that's done, right? So we've got this like rich purple mud. We can even use something like curves to kind of darken that and get that even more dark and saturated. And creating kind of a deep night of shadow. Now we're going to really do additive light on this. So we're going to, instead of chiseling it out with shadow, we've created shadow. I'm going to use pure painting and no layer effects to pull the color out of this guy. So I'm right up in the corner here. See this? I'm really riding the saturation. I'm going to start darker and closer to the palette we started with, because you're building, you're kind of inching towards the color you want to use. So setting that up with a little like deep purple blue, and then coming in with let's go really hot kind of cerulean. Color names are not my strongest suit. Right. And then all the way into like a, let's see, where is that? Kind of a greeny goodness. There we go. Because I've set up these cool, rich colors, bringing in things that are warmer on top of it, it's going to get this really nice sense of glowing light out of what we're doing. You see, I'm sampling. I'm doing the color picker. I'm pulling back some of those darks in there. And I'm going back and forth, trying to get it just the way I want. Again, pretty neutral, simple stuff. So without the sketch layer, just to show you guys what we're working with, something like this. And that's really fun. So we're going to lean into some of these blues. And it's funny, sometimes the highlight, people always focus on like, oh, that shiny bit or that contrast bit. But what I'm trying to show you here, and you'll see as we go, is that those really shiny moments, those really exciting bits, result from really building up a context, sort of giving it color that lives around it, that's going to help you build that deep color contrast. All right, let me just think. So I'm going to do kind of pull a little bit of a blue people avatar here, and we're going to give him some sort of dark blue stripy patterning, right? Keeping it pretty saturated and painting right on through it. Give him some tiger stripes down his forehead. Thinking about this like beautiful purple blue midnight color palette. I'm using a simple brush, pressure sensitive opacity, to create some fun patterns. trying not to get too lost in the design, because that's a big trap when you're doing a tutorial, is just getting caught up. And ooh, let's see, who is he? The point is not necessarily who he is, not with this anyways. I'm just thinking about, I mean, ultimately in design and anything with color, you're telling a story. You are creating a feeling. Brush a little bit more dark blue, create, and then brush back some of these so that they feel a little more blended into the skin, right? And then I lost this antenna here, so I'm going to go back in and paint over these with that. Okay. So that that's over the pattern and not under the pattern. Oh, that's fighting me there. And the reality is, like, sometimes color and painting is just a fight. It's just a big fight. And even now, even, you know, years into working professionally as a concept artist, I still have these moments, often, actually, pretty often, where I'm just like, I just have no idea if this is going to work. I don't know what I'm doing. And it's, but that's kind of part of what's exciting still. You know, if you always were sure that it was going to work perfectly, it wouldn't be very fun, you know? Part of the fun is the free fall, and that's when you know you're really trying something new and you're pushing on your skill set and really going for it. That's when you're out on a limb and you're like, man, I'm painting on one layer, I don't know if this is going to work out. So really, you know, I'm working in blues and purples, but it's almost like I'm working in black and white because I'm chiseling out shapes and creating a sense of his design based on light and shadow. I'm not going to pay attention to the fact that his eye is really wonky and skewed on the far side. It's fine. We don't need to worry about all the specifics, because this is about the color. And sometimes, so part of this part of the process, right, you're thinking like, oh, I want to use the orange, I want to like add the glowy bits, but that's dessert, you know? That's, you gotta like do all the work to set up the rich purpley goodness so that the yellowy orangey highlights are just super tasty on top. All right, so we're gonna start in on that, right? So we've set up this rich purple blue space, and in order to contextualize it, we're going to shift it gradually towards what I want to get is like somewhere up in here, and then eventually even all the way to like yellow, but we got to walk it towards that. We're going to use a rich, dark, saturated purple pink and a soft brush. It's the ends of his antennas that are going to glow first, and so we're going to brush that in, right? That's like the light bleeding through those, and he's got these kind of gills. I have a little bit of light in there too. Plenty of fun moments. So he's kind of got a little blush, a little cute little blush in his gills, right? Now we're adding this purple, creating some contrast. Now I'm going to shift it even further up, hotter pink, right? As we build. And see, no layer effects, but still glowy, even glowier, really. Just with color contrast, because we're not only going, we're saturated, but we're creating color contrast between warm and cool. So that's upping the sense of glow. Light and dark, we're also, you know, we've gone from like values here, like if we look at this in the color picker, it's further down in the middle. This up here, it's a little further up, and we're getting hotter and hotter as we go. And now we're really going to just jump right in. We're going to get the peachy, orangey color of our dreams. We're going to test it. It's not quite it yet. It still needs some context. I'm going to brush some orange into that pink. There we go. See how simple? See, it's really, to get that glow, what's ultimately going to feel like a light. It's a lot of building context. Almost all the way. All right. Get some of that pink back because the pink's really hot. Pink is giving it context. We're building from pink to a brighter yellow. Now it's pretty hard because those are out there and they're against white, so it's a little hard to sort of get the full sense of the glowy qualities of it. So we're going to work some of this into his little gills too. Because he's largely blue and not super duper purple, it's actually something in the orange range that's going to get us a really intense sense of light. There we go. See that? It feels like there's like a hot, fiery light under the skin here. There we go. We're going to do the same thing with his little eyes. And build some contrast there. And again, it's all about setting up context. You can go right in with giant, bold primary colors, and eventually you can just straight up do that. That's totally a way to do it. But I think when you're learning, especially, learning to build up from a mud is really important and fun. And you get to understand the principles better this way, of color and of contrast. Maybe not on that one. And a lot of it, you see, it's not perfect. It's not immediately like, oh, but it's getting there. And we're getting that sense of light in there. And when it works and when it's done, it can be really rewarding. Perfect. There we go. So there's that. And then to pump that up all the more, I'm going to use an overlay effect and a soft brush to just intensify that glow. It's just going to add some of the richness in. Again, give it a little more gradient context than I was able to brush in by hand. Just pull some of that light in there. And we're also going to enrich that with a really intense blue-green. Oops, not all over though. We want some of those neutrals. What's making this work, and you might not know it, is the fact that there's desaturated portions of it. It's not all maximum saturation blue. Some of it's a little bit grayer. It's a little bit sort of darker and more neutral. And that's what's bringing out some of the fun color. And one of the things that's also key here too is like we're working against white. If I were to throw this guy against like a really dark background, like he's underwater, that's when you really get some of the glow in there and you really can see how that's working. We can step into curves since the background's changed. Now we're going to change some of the values on him, and we can really see that there's a glowy sense of the light happening. That's really fun and has that kind of wild alien undersea kind of vibe. And if this were Jellybots, which it very well could be, then we go in, and it's the last thing you do is add those specular highlights. And I think I'll probably do another tutorial soon if you guys are interested about jelly specifically, and really dig into what makes jelly work, how that happens. But it's not till the end, that I add the highlights. You plan for them, you think about them, but you don't go straight for them, because that just kind of ruins the fun of discovery. And I don't just add highlights at the end. Sometimes I realize, like, oh, the drawing needs beefing up. I need to see where his mouth is. I don't really come in and add some line art or some sort of darker value structure to help bring that out. So, to review, we talked about complementary color pairings, which is the building blocks of color contrast. We talked about local color versus the color of light, and the color of shadow, and how shadow color loosely groups to complementary pairings. If you have warm light, you'll have cool shadows. If you have cool light, you'll have warmer shadows. And we've looked at that on a more neutral background, sort of the more neutral skin and flesh tones of this old dude, and the more intense colors of this glowy alien. And hopefully that has shed some light on the color process and how I think through these things. I hope that was useful. Please leave any questions in the comments section. Do let me know if you have any feedback or you want to see anything else in these tutorials in the future. I could do a follow-up on this. I will gladly answer questions in the comments and in future posts. Again, thank you all so much for your support. This has been a blast, and I wish you all the best. See you next month.